Fantasy Bedtime Stories presents Void Dragon Chronicles, Volume 1, Chapter 1, Zara, Between Shadow and Light.
Liar's Gate rose from the coastline like some great beast half-emerged from the sea. I watched it appear on the horizon, barnacled stone foundations giving way to timber and brick climbing upward in chaotic layers. Nothing like the fishing villages of my childhood. This city pulsed with frenetic energy that I could feel even from the approaching ship's deck. I knew it would devour me if I let it. I'd been on the merchant vessel for nearly 2 weeks, having stowed away when it docked briefly at the coastal settlement where I'd been working odd jobs. The captain found me only a day before we reached port. I prepared myself for the worst. Being thrown overboard wouldn't have been unusual treatment for a stowaway, but something in my eyes must have reminded him of his own children. He merely demanded I work for my passage, helping the cook until we reached Liar's Gate.
Find yourself some proper work in Liar's Gate, girl.
He advised gruffly as I disembarked.
City'll eat you alive otherwise.
I nodded solemnly. What was the point in telling him I had no intention of seeking proper work? Proper work meant visibility. Visibility meant questions. Questions about a dark-skinned girl with strange eyes traveling alone inevitably led to authorities, which meant orphanages. Or worse. Especially for someone whose shadow occasionally moved independently when I grew tired or careless. Instead, I fell back on survival skills honed over 2 years of transient existence. By nightfall, I'd found a relatively safe sleeping spot in the eaves of an old warehouse, located the public fountains for washing, identified which market stalls discarded edible food at day's end, and begun studying the rhythms of the city's commercial districts. The hunger was the hardest part. In smaller towns, I'd supplemented scavenging with herbs and edible plants gathered from surrounding countryside. In Liar's Gate, the forests had been cleared for miles to feed the city's shipbuilding appetite, and the urban sprawl offered few growing things that weren't carefully guarded in private gardens. After a week of gnawing emptiness that made my shadow abilities flicker unpredictably, I made a calculated decision. I would become a thief. Not for pleasure, not for greed, but for survival. Mother would have been disappointed, perhaps, but Senna had also been practical. Morality is a luxury of the fed and sheltered. She'd once told a village woman who criticized her treatment of a pregnant girl cast out by her family. I clung to this memory as justification. My first attempts were clumsy, but successful. A fruit here, a bread roll there, taken from busy stalls when vendors were distracted. Small, immediate necessities to quiet my stomach. But I'm observant, and within days, I'd graduated to more valuable targets. The coin purses that hung from merchants' belts, the small valuable trinkets displayed too near a stall's edge. I developed rules to ease my conscience. Never steal from the poor. Never take more than could be spared. Never target the kind or vulnerable. Focus on those who flaunted wealth or mistreated others. It wasn't justice exactly, but it allowed me to sleep at night. For nearly 2 weeks, my new profession proceeded without incident, until today. The central marketplace heaved with midday commerce, the air thick with competing scents of spices, grilled meat, and too many bodies pressed together under the relentless summer sun. I moved through the crowd, my long dreadlocks tied back securely and partly covered with a faded scarf that helped me blend with the city's diverse inhabitants. I'd spotted my target 10 minutes earlier, a wealthy merchant easily identified by his richly dyed robes and the casual cruelty with which he'd struck a porter who had stumbled near his goods. His purse hung heavy at his belt, momentarily exposed each time he turned to examine another stall's offerings. I circled patiently, waiting for the perfect moment. When the merchant became engrossed in a heated negotiation over imported silks, I moved. Drawing the shadows around myself, not enough to be noticed, as unnatural just enough to dull attention, I slipped through the crowd. My fingers, nimble from years of gathering herbs alongside my mother, extended toward the purse. The moment my fingers brushed the leather, everything went wrong. A hand like iron clamped around my wrist. So quickly I hadn't even seen it move. Before I could process what was happening, I found myself pulled aside into the narrow space between two stalls, face to face with my captor. The woman who held me was tall, taller than any woman I'd ever seen, with broad shoulders and the lean musculature of someone who had spent a lifetime in physical pursuits. Her face bore 3 parallel scars across her left cheek, old enough to have faded to silvery lines against her dark brown skin. Salt and pepper hair was cropped close to her scalp, revealing the shape of a beautifully formed head that she held with natural authority. Most striking were her eyes, dark and sharply intelligent, missing nothing as they systematically assessed me from head to toe. Those eyes belonged to someone who had seen everything the world had to offer and remained unimpressed by most of it. I immediately tried to call the shadows to conceal myself, but exhaustion and panic made my magic sputter like a dying flame. The woman's grip tightened fractionally, not enough to hurt but sufficient to communicate that escape was not an option.
Stop that,
She said quietly, her voice surprisingly melodic for someone so physically imposing.
You'll only exhaust yourself further.
I froze, shock replacing fear. No one had ever so casually acknowledged my shadow work before. Even my mother had approached the topic with reverent caution. I'm not, I began automatically.
Save it.
She cut me off with a small shake of her head.
You have a gift for moving unseen, but your technique needs work. You're what, 16? 17? Too young to waste potential on amateur grabs that will land you in a cell or worse.
She released my wrist but positioned herself to block any escape route. Not that I was considering running. Curiosity had temporarily overcome self-preservation. Who are you? I demanded, trying to sound brave despite my racing heart.
Name's Mira.
The woman glanced toward the marketplace, ensuring we weren't drawing attention.
I'm in transport and logistics.
A slight quirk at the corner of her mouth suggested this description was both accurate and woefully incomplete. I'm not looking for work, I said automatically. Mira snorted, a surprisingly inelegant sound from someone so composed.
Of course you are. Look at you. Half-starved, unwashed, picking pockets in one of the most heavily patrolled markets in Liarsgate. You're not doing this for entertainment.
Something in her matter-of-fact assessment broke through my carefully constructed defenses. After 2 years of hiding who and what I was, the simple acknowledgement of my reality felt unexpectedly powerful. I do what I have to, I said, lifting my chin slightly.
As we all do.
Mira nodded, respect flickering briefly in her expression.
But there's doing what you must, and then there's doing it well. You have potential, girl. Considerable potential, especially with that shadow trick you were trying to use. But potential without training is just another path to an early grave.
My eyes narrowed suspiciously. I'd encountered adults offering help before, their kindness inevitably a thin veneer over exploitation. Yet something about Mira seemed different, her assessment professional rather than predatory. What do you want? I asked bluntly. Mira smiled then, a genuine expression that transformed her scarred face into something approaching warmth.
Direct good. I appreciate that in a potential associate.
She glanced around once more before continuing. Her voice lowered.
I run a small but successful transport business. Sometimes legal, often not. I need reliable people who can move without being noticed, deliver messages discreetly, occasionally serve as lookouts, people with particular talents.
Her gaze flicked meaningfully to the shadows at my feet, which still rippled subtly in response to my agitation.
In exchange,
Mira continued.
I offer honest pay, a safe place to sleep, regular meals, and training in useful skills that will keep you alive considerably longer than your current trajectory.
I weighed the offer silently. The promise of food and shelter was tempting, especially as Liarsgate's unforgiving winter approached. But trust came difficultly after years of betrayal. Why would you help me? I asked, unashamed of my suspicion. Mira's expression shifted subtly. Something old and painful, briefly surfacing before submerging again beneath her composed exterior.
Let's call it professional interest,
she said after a moment.
I recognize talent, and I detest waste. You have the former in abundance, and your current path leads only to the latter.
She paused, then added with unexpected gentleness.
I also know what it is to be young and alone with abilities others fear.
Before I could respond, a commotion erupted in the marketplace. Guards were moving through the crowd, responding to the merchant's belated discovery of an attempted theft.
Decision time.
Mara said briskly.
Come with me now, or take your chances with the Port Authority. They're particularly creative with young thieves these days.
I hesitated only a moment longer. My survival instincts, honed through years of hardship, recognized the difference between danger and opportunity. Lead on, I said simply. Mara nodded once, then guided me through a series of narrow alleyways with the confidence of someone who knew every forgotten corner of Liar's Gate. We moved swiftly away from the marketplace, ascending through progressively quieter districts until we reached an area dominated by warehouses and shipping offices.
Welcome to legitimate commerce.
Mara said with dry humor as we approached a 2-story timber building wedged between larger warehouses. The sign above the door read, Coastal Transit and Storage, in faded but respectable lettering. The interior surprised me with its orderly efficiency. The ground floor clearly served as a proper business office, with clerks managing ledgers and clients discussing shipping arrangements. Mara nodded to several employees as she led me up a narrow staircase to the second floor. This level was clearly more private, a combination of living quarters and what I would later learn was the operational center for Mara's less official business ventures. A large central room held maps covering most available wall space, a sturdy table surrounded by chairs, and shelves laden with records and curious objects from distant ports.
You'll sleep here tonight.
Mara said, indicating a small but clean side room with a proper bed. The first I'd seen since my mother's death.
Get some rest. Eat when you're hungry.
She gestured toward a sideboard laden with bread, cheese, and fruit.
Tomorrow, we'll discuss specifics of your employment and begin your proper education.
She turned to leave, then paused, fixing me with a penetrating look.
One condition is non-negotiable. Absolute loyalty and discretion. Cross me, and you'll find yourself back on the streets, if you're fortunate. Understand?
I nodded solemnly. I understand loyalty, I said quietly, thinking of my mother. Something in my tone must have convinced her, because she offered another of her rare smiles before departing.
We'll get along fine then.
Left alone, I carefully inspected my new surroundings with the thoroughness my circumstances had taught me. The room contained a bed with clean linens, a small chest for possessions I didn't have, a washing basin, and a narrow window overlooking a side street. More luxury than I'd known in years. After confirming there were no obvious traps or means of imprisonment, I allowed myself to approach the food. With practiced restraint, I took only modest portions despite my gnawing hunger, wrapping a small amount in a napkin and secreting it in my clothing. A habit of survival too ingrained to abandon immediately. As the unfamiliar comfort of a full stomach and safe shelter began to relax my vigilance, I finally allowed myself to lie on the bed, my mother's obsidian pendant clutched tightly in my hand. I felt the shadows in the room respond to my exhaustion, gathering around me like a protective blanket. For the first time since leaving Morwen's Cove, I slept deeply and without fear. The education Mara promised began before dawn.
Up!
A voice commanded, accompanied by a brisk knock that startled me from sleep.
Sunrise in 20 minutes. Be ready.
Years of survival had trained me to transition instantly from sleep to alertness. I was dressed and waiting, face washed and dreadlocks neatly tied back, when Mara returned exactly 20 minutes later. Approval flickered briefly across her face.
Good. Promptness matters in our line of work. The difference between success and capture is often measured in seconds.
That first day established a pattern that would define the next several years of my life. Mornings began with physical training, running across Liar's Gate's rooftops, strength exercises that made my muscles burn, learning to move without sound across various surfaces.
Your shadow gift is valuable,
Mara explained during one grueling session.
but the body that houses it must be equally capable. Magic fails. Muscles properly trained are more reliable.
Afternoons focused on mental development, reading and mathematics, understanding commerce and currency, studying maps of Liar's Gate until I could navigate blindfolded. Mara proved to be a demanding but unexpectedly patient teacher, adapting her methods to my quick, intuitive learning style. Evenings brought practical application, accompanying Mara on business errands that gradually revealed the true nature of coastal transit and storage. The legitimate shipping company served as cover for a complex operation that included smuggling, information brokering, occasional theft of specific items, and what Mara called creative problem solving for clients with discretion requirements.
We're not common criminals.
Mara explained one night as we observed a harbor master accepting bribes from a rival operation.
We provide necessary services that exist between established structures. Some call it crime. I call it meeting market demand.
2 weeks into this new life, I worked up the courage to ask about the scars on Mara's face. We sat on the roof of the coastal transit building, sharing a simple meal after a day spent identifying optimal routes through the city's western district. The setting sun cast long shadows across Liar's Gate's jumbled architecture, the kind of shadows that seemed to whisper to me in ways I still didn't fully understand. "The scars," I said, pointing briefly to my own cheek to clarify my question. "How did you get them?" Mara was silent long enough that I thought I might have overstepped. Finally, she set down her cup and turned to face me directly.
You've noticed I never ask about your past or your shadow magic,
she said, her voice matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. I nodded cautiously.
That's because pasts belong to those who live them. Share if you wish. Keep your secrets if you prefer.
Mara's fingers traced the silvery lines across her cheek in an apparently unconscious gesture.
They're a reminder of the most important lesson in our profession. Trust selectively.
She paused, seeming to weigh how much to reveal.
I was your age, perhaps a year older, running messages for a crew in Sanket, the city of my birth. Got careless. Trusted someone who saw me as a means to eliminate competition.
The simplicity of her statement couldn't disguise the pain beneath it. I waited, sensing there was more.
The man who did this. He worked for my mentor,
she continued, gesturing to her scars.
Someone I trusted completely. I survived. I learned. I improved my judgment of character.
I absorbed this in silence, recognizing the gift of trust such a revelation represented. "Is that why you helped me?" I asked finally. "Because someone didn't help you?" Mira's laugh held genuine amusement.
Sharp mind, good, but no, not entirely.
Her expression grew serious again.
I helped you because you remind me of myself at your age. Talented, determined, too smart for simple crime, too practical for honest poverty.
She gestured toward the city spread below us.
Liar's Gate devours the weak and unwary. You were heading toward a predictable end. Prison or worse. It would have been a waste.
She shrugged slightly.
I detest waste.
The matter-of-fact assessment should have felt cold, but I found it oddly comforting. Her interest might be partly practical, but it was honest. No false sentimentality. No hidden agenda I could detect. "Thank you," I said simply. Mira nodded acknowledgement, then seamlessly transitioned back to business.
Tomorrow we begin your formal training in observation and assessment. The ability to read people and situations accurately is our most valuable skill.
And so it went. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Gradually, my role within coastal transit evolved from simple messenger to trusted assistant. My shadow magic, carefully hidden from all but Mira, proved invaluable for certain discrete operations, retrieving documents from secured locations, overhearing private conversations, creating distractions when necessary. Mara never pushed me to explain these abilities, simply incorporating them into our work with practical efficiency.
Your gifts are your own.
She said when I hesitantly attempted to explain their origin.
Use them well, protect them from exploitation, and never become dependent on them. That's all that matters.
By the end of my first year in Liar's Gate, I had changed dramatically from the half-starved, desperate child Mira had caught in the marketplace. Regular meals had filled out my thin frame, while training had added lean muscle. My natural grace had been refined into something more deliberate and controlled. Most significantly, the constant fear that had been my companion for so long had receded, replaced by growing confidence and purpose. I still maintained certain habits from my time alone, hiding small caches of food and valuables throughout the city, mapping escape routes wherever I went, sleeping lightly enough to wake at unusual sounds. Mira noticed but never commented, recognizing survival mechanisms when she saw them. On the anniversary of my arrival at Coastal Transit, Mira presented me with 2 gifts, a set of custom lockpicks of exceptional quality and a small book bound in blue leather.
The picks are practical.
She explained as I examined their perfect balance and fine craftsmanship.
The journal is necessary. Record your observations, your thoughts, the patterns you notice. The sharpest blade dulls without proper maintenance. The same is true of the mind.
That night, alone in my room, a larger space than my initial accommodation, now personalized with small treasures and books, I made my first entry. 1 year with M. She says I have graduated from desperate survival to professional competence. High praise from her. The business grows. We added 2 new regular clients this month. Merchants from the Southern Isles with profitable cargo and problematic customs regulations. My shadow work strengthens with practice. Yesterday, I maintained concealment for nearly an hour without exhaustion. M never asks questions, but creates opportunities for me to use these abilities. I think she understands more than she admits. I am learning to trust again, but carefully. M says, selective trust is different from vulnerability. Trust is a tool, she says. Deploy it strategically. I wonder what Mother would think of my life now. Not a healer like her, but not merely surviving either. M says we provide necessary services, filling gaps between official structures. Perhaps that's not so different from Mother's work after all. She too operated in spaces others overlooked. The obsidian pendant grows warmer when I work with shadows now. Connection, research needed. I closed the journal, running my fingers over its smooth cover. Mira had been right. Articulating my thoughts clarified them somehow, bringing half-formed patterns into sharper relief. Outside my window, Liar's Gate continued its perpetual symphony of commerce and intrigue. Inside, for the first time since my mother's death, I felt something like belonging. The following years brought increasing responsibility and deepening trust between Mira and me. By 19, I had become an essential part of Coastal Transit's operations, my quick mind and unique abilities making me particularly valuable for the most sensitive assignments. Our professional relationship gradually evolved into something neither of us openly acknowledged, but both recognized. Something approaching family. Not with the demonstrative affection I vaguely remembered from my early childhood, but a deeper recognition of kindred spirits navigating a complex world with similar values and complementary skills. Mira never attempted to replace my lost mother, maintaining instead the role of mentor and employer. Yet small gestures revealed deeper care, ensuring I received proper education beyond practical skills, creating space for me to explore my shadow abilities privately, intervening swiftly and decisively when others attempted to exploit or harm me. In turn, my initial wariness transformed into fierce loyalty. I applied my intelligence and unique talents to advancing Mira's interests, gradually helping transform Coastal Transit from a modestly successful operation into one of Liar's Gate's most respected and feared independent enterprises. Together, we established a reputation for absolute reliability within clearly defined parameters. We wouldn't accept contracts involving unnecessary violence, would never target children or the desperately poor, and once committed to a job, would complete it regardless of complications.
Reputation is our most valuable asset.
Mira often reminded her crew, which had grown to include a handful of carefully selected specialists.
In our business, trust must be earned through perfect consistency.
This philosophy served us well, attracting clients willing to pay premium rates for guaranteed results and discretion. By the time I turned 17, I had graduated from assistant to partner in all but name, often running operations independently while Mira handled client relations and overall strategy. The shadow magic that had once threatened to expose me had become my greatest professional asset, refined through careful practice and Mira's pragmatic guidance. What had begun as simple concealment had developed into a sophisticated set of skills, creating distractions by manipulating shadows across a room, temporarily obscuring written words on documents to avoid detection, sensing others' presence through their shadow impressions. Life had found a steady, if unconventional, rhythm, which was precisely why I should have been more suspicious when everything changed. The warehouse job should have been routine. Retrieve financial records from a merchant suspected of cheating his business partners, allowing Mara's clients to confront him with evidence rather than accusations. I had done similar work dozens of times, often without assistance. But this particular merchant had connections to Liarsgate's governance, necessitating additional caution. Mara insisted on accompanying me personally rather than sending another team member.
Something feels wrong about this one,
She admitted as we reviewed the building plans one final time.
The client was too eager, the payment too generous for relatively straightforward information.
I had learned to trust Mara's instincts. Should we decline?
No,
She said after consideration.
but we proceed with maximum caution, complete the job exactly as planned. No improvisation, no matter what opportunities present themselves.
We approached the warehouse separately, me from the rooftops, Mara through the service alley that ran behind the commercial district. The plan was simple. Mara would create a distraction by apparently attempting to break in through the loading dock, drawing any guards in that direction, while I would use my shadow paths to enter through an upper window and retrieve the documents from the merchant's office. Everything proceeded according to plan, until it didn't. I had successfully entered the office and located the relevant records when I heard something that shouldn't have been possible. Mara's voice, raised in what sounded like pain. Mara, who moved like silence itself. Mara, who had contingencies for her contingencies. Mara, who had never in 5 years been caught unaware during an operation. Training Ward with loyalty as I hesitated, the documents already secured in my pack. Our cardinal rule was clear. If separated during a job, proceed to the designated meeting point. No deviations, no heroics, no compromising the operation. But this was Mara. Decision made, I secured the pack and moved toward the sound, drawing shadows around myself until I was nearly invisible. I descended silently to the loading dock, where raised voices suggested a confrontation in progress. What I saw from my concealed position made my blood run cold. Mara knelt on the rough wooden planks, hands bound behind her, a cut above her eye leaking blood down her impassive face. Around her stood 6 figures, not the merchant's regular guards, but professional mercenaries identifiable by their matching leather armor and disciplined positioning. Most disturbing was the man giving orders, Haslin, one of our own specialists, recently hired to handle complex lock mechanisms. I had never fully trusted him. Mara had counseled patience, arguing his skills outweighed his questionable background. Now he stood before Mara, triumph evident in his posture as he spoke into her stony silence.
Waste of potential. Working small jobs in a backwater port.
He was saying,
Cost Guild pays 3 times your rate and offers actual advancement. All they want is your client list and operational methods. Provide those. Walk away intact. Simple business decision.
Mara's response was a cold smile.
You've miscalculated badly, Haslin. If you had actual backing from Cast, they'd have sent more than hired muscle and a lockpick with delusions of competence.
The casual dismissal clearly struck a nerve. Haslin's hand cracked across Mara's face, splitting her lip.
Miscalculated. Your precious operation is finished. Your protege is likely already captured upstairs. Coastal Transit becomes a footnote in Liarsgate's commercial history, while I secure a position with an organization that understands ambition.
From my concealed position, I assessed the situation with the clarity Mara had trained into me. 6 armed opponents. Mara bound but apparently uninjured beyond superficial wounds. Multiple exit points, all currently guarded. Direct confrontation would be suicide. But shadow work, real shadow work, not the minor manipulations I typically employed during operations, might create an opportunity. Taking a slow, centering breath, I reached for my mother's pendant, drawing strength from its familiar contours as I gathered the shadows around me. Not just for concealment now, but as tools, as weapons, as extensions of my will. What happened next would later become whispered legend among Liarsgate's criminal elements. The loading dock plunged into unnatural darkness, deeper than the absence of light should allow. Within that darkness, shadows moved with purpose, snuffing lanterns, tangling mercenaries' feet, temporarily blinding those who tried to maintain formation. Confusion erupted as disciplined professionals suddenly found themselves unable to trust their senses. Orders turned to curses as they collided with each other, weapons drawn but useless against an enemy they couldn't locate. In the chaos, I moved with precision, born from years of training combined with innate talent. I reached Mira first, shadows briefly solidifying into a blade-like edge that severed the ropes binding her hands. "Exit Route 3, I whispered against her ear. 30 seconds. Without waiting for acknowledgement, I turned my attention to Haslin, who was shouting increasingly desperate commands to his disoriented mercenaries. The shadows around him condensed, wrapping around his ankle and yanking with sudden force. He crashed to the dock with a satisfying impact that knocked the breath from his lungs. Maintaining this level of shadow manipulation demanded more energy than I had ever channeled. My vision began to blur at the edges, the obsidian pendant burning against my skin like a coal. But I held on, directing the unnatural darkness to remain thickest around the mercenaries while creating a dimly visible path that only Mara would know to look for. We escaped through a maintenance tunnel that ran beneath the loading dock, emerging 3 streets away from the warehouse, just as my control finally shattered. The shadows snapped back to their natural state, and I stumbled, suddenly drained beyond exhaustion. Mara caught me before I could fall, supporting my weight with ease as we made our way through back alleys toward a rarely used safe house rather than returning directly to coastal transit.
That
Mara said when we were finally secure and had confirmed we weren't followed.
was either the most impressive rescue I've ever witnessed, or the most foolish violation of operational protocol in coastal transit's history.
She examined my exhausted form with clinical attention, noting the pallor beneath my dark skin and the slight tremor in my hands. Without comment, she prepared a restorative tea from supplies kept at the safe house, adding honey and what I suspected might be medicinal brandy.
Drink?
She ordered, pressing the steaming cup into my hands.
Then explain what exactly happened back there.
I sipped the bracing liquid, feeling warmth spread through my depleted body. "You told me shadow work had practical applications," I said finally, attempting humor despite my exhaustion. Mara didn't smile.
What you did goes beyond practical application. That was something else entirely.
For the first time in our association, Mara appeared genuinely shaken.
The darkness was alive, Zara. It moved with purpose, with intelligence.
I stared into my cup, uncertain how to explain what I myself didn't fully understand. "It's always been possible," I said finally, "since I was a child. But it costs energy, control. I don't use it often."
Because it's dangerous.
Mira concluded, her voice neutral rather than accusatory. "Because it's personal," I corrected quietly. "My mother taught me that some gifts aren't meant for casual use." Silence stretched between us, heavy with unasked questions and implications. Finally, Mara nodded once, decisively.
Your methods are your own,
she said, returning to her customary pragmatism.
The results speak for themselves. But next time, if there is a next time, consider the operational implications before revealing capabilities of that magnitude. Information is currency, and you've just spent a considerable sum.
It was as close to a thank you as Mara was likely to offer, I knew. But the slight softening around her eyes conveyed what words did not. Recognition of the risk I had taken. Not for the operation, but for her. "Haslin?" I asked, changing the subject.
Will be dealt with. More concerning is how he knew about the job. Very few people had those details.
We spent the night at the safe house, reviewing security protocols and identifying potential weaknesses in our organization. By dawn, exhaustion finally overcame even Mira's iron discipline, and we both slept briefly before returning to coastal transit through carefully indirect routes. In the weeks that followed, changes rippled through our operation. Several peripheral associates were quietly removed from sensitive positions. Security measures intensified. Mara became more selective about which jobs we accepted and which clients we served. For me, the most significant change was more personal. Though Mara never directly referenced the shadow manipulation again, she created increased opportunities for me to practice and refine these abilities in private. A secure room in the warehouse was cleared for my use. Specific jobs were structured to allow for shadow work when appropriate. Most telling was the small book that appeared on my bed one evening, a treatise on threshold magic from the Eastern Territories, rare enough that its acquisition must have required considerable resources and connections. Inside the front cover, Mara had written in her precise hand, "Knowledge is protection. Develop all your weapons." It was the closest she would come to acknowledging what had become increasingly clear. My shadow magic represented both opportunity and risk for coastal transit. Rather than fear it, Mira had chosen to incorporate it into her strategic calculations, treating it as she did all valuable assets, with practical appreciation for its utility and clear-eyed assessment of its limitations. For me, the experience marked a turning point in how I viewed my own abilities. What had begun as instinctive self-preservation, then developed into practical tool, now revealed itself as something deeper, a fundamental aspect of my nature that could not be separated from who I was becoming. In my journal that night, I wrote, "The shadows are not separate from me, nor I from them. They are not absence, but presence of a different kind. Just as Mother always said. Today I stopped fighting this truth. Tomorrow I begin truly understanding it. What neither I nor Mara could have anticipated was how short our remaining time together would be, or how the shadow paths I was just beginning to fully embrace would soon become my only route to survival, once again." The expansion of coastal transit happened with a swiftness that surprised even Mira, and honestly shocked me too. What began as our carefully controlled growth strategy transformed rapidly after we secured the Silver Hall contract, an exclusive arrangement with a consortium of 5 merchant houses to handle their most valuable shipments throughout the northern trade routes.
We're becoming respectable.
Mara observed Riley one morning as she studied our newly expanded ledgers in her private office. The spring sunlight streaming through the windows caught the silver in her close-cropped hair, highlighting how much she had aged since finding me in the marketplace. Not old, but weathered, like fine leather that had been tested by elements and emerged stronger for it. I leaned against the doorframe, watching her. At 20, I had finally grown into myself. My dreadlocks were pulled back in an intricate style, adorned with the brass beads I'd accumulated over years of successful operations, each one a silent testament to lessons learned and skills mastered. My reflection in mirrors no longer startled me with its healthy appearance, so different from the half-starved child I'd been. "Respectable might be stretching it," I replied with a hint of amusement. "We did just redirect half a shipment of Sarathian wine to the governor's rival last week." Mara's laugh was a rare sound, deep and genuine. I treasured these moments when her careful composure softened, revealing the woman beneath the strategist.
Details.
She dismissed with a wave.
The point is, we're visible now, in ways we weren't before.
That visibility came with undeniable benefits. We now operated from a compound of 3 warehouses and an impressive office building in Liarsgate's merchant district. Our legitimate shipping business had tripled in size, providing even better cover for our specialized services. We employed 37 people, 22 in the official business, 15 in what Mara called auxiliary operations, and I sometimes thought of as our shadow family. Most significantly, our reputation had transcended Liarsgate's borders. Coastal Transit was known throughout the northern coastal cities as an operation that delivered on its promises with unmatched efficiency and discretion. This reputation brought clients willing to pay premium rates, including nobles and officials who would never have considered working with us in earlier years. But as Mara had taught me long ago, every advantage carries corresponding risks. Visibility attracted attention, not all of it welcome. The first warnings came through my network of informants that I'd carefully cultivated over the years. Unusual inquiries about our security protocols, strangers observing our warehouses with too much interest, competing transport companies suddenly declining contracts that would put them in direct competition with us. Someone's planning something, I concluded during one of our evening strategy sessions on the rooftop. Too many coincidences. Mira nodded, her expression neutral, but her eyes alert in that way I'd learned to read years ago.
The question is who, and what exactly they're planning.
We implemented additional security measures, adjusted routes and schedules, planted misleading information through controlled channels, increased compartmentalization of sensitive operations so that few people understood the complete picture, a strategy Mara had perfected over decades in the business. Despite these precautions, I felt a growing unease, a sense that something fundamental was shifting beneath the surface of our carefully constructed world. I mentioned this to Mara one evening, feeling foolish for relying on what amounted to intuition rather than evidence.
Never discount instinct, especially yours. You perceive things others miss. It's part of your shadow nature. Increase your personal security. Don't travel the same routes. Be particularly careful whom you trust.
The advice proved prophetic sooner than either of us anticipated. Thorne entered my life 3 months later, introduced through a careful series of intermediaries as a specialist in threshold access, a euphemism for their extraordinary talent at bypassing seemingly impenetrable security systems. Slender and graceful, with an ageless quality that made them impossible to place chronologically, Thorne immediately caught my attention for reasons beyond their professional capabilities. Most striking were their mismatched eyes, one amber, one deep blue, that seemed to perceive beyond conventional sight. The contrast was mesmerizing, the amber eye warm and penetrating, the blue one cool and analytical. When they focused their gaze on you, it felt as though they were seeing multiple versions of reality simultaneously. Their face was a study in perfect symmetry, except for those eyes. High cheekbones, a straight nose, and lips that seemed permanently arranged in a slight curve, suggesting they were privy to some subtle humor others had missed. Their skin was a pale olive tone that seemed to shift subtly depending on the light, sometimes appearing almost luminescent under certain conditions. They stood slightly taller than me, with a slender build that belied considerable strength. I observed this during our first meeting when they effortlessly moved a heavy cabinet to demonstrate a particular threshold concept. Their hands fascinated me. Long, tapered fingers with prominent knuckles and nails kept precisely trimmed. These were hands of both an artist and a technician, equally capable of delicate manipulation and forceful action when required. Thorne dressed in clothes that seemed deliberately designed to avoid attention, while still maintaining a distinctive elegance. Garments in muted colors cut from fabrics that moved like liquid when they walked. No jewelry except for a single silver ring on their right index finger, engraved with symbols I didn't recognize, but that resonated oddly with my shadow senses whenever I looked at them directly. They moved with fluid grace that reminded me of shadow currents, every gesture precise and economical, as if they'd calculated the exact amount of energy required and used nothing more. Their voice carried the slight accent of the Eastern Territories, where magical traditions were more openly studied, a musical cadence that gave common words unexpected depth and made their explanations of complex threshold concepts seem almost like poetry. Their age was impossible to determine. Sometimes, when explaining fundamental threshold concepts, they spoke with the weight of decades or even centuries of experience. Other times, when excited by a new application of theory, they displayed an almost childlike enthusiasm that made them seem barely older than me. When I once tried to subtly inquire about their background, they merely smiled that enigmatic smile and said,
"Age becomes irrelevant when you spend enough time between moments."
Most disconcerting was how they carried shadow with them, not manipulating it as I did, but existing partially within it at all times. Even in bright rooms, the light seemed to bend slightly around them, as if reluctant to fully illuminate their form. It wasn't a technique or conscious manipulation. It was their natural state of being, a person who lived partially in the threshold realm, even when physically present in conventional reality. I realized Thorn's threshold nature extended to their very identity during our third training session. One of Mira's associates, new to our operation, made the mistake of addressing Thorn as Madam when delivering documents. I noticed the subtle shift in Thorn's expression. Not offense, but a momentary flicker of something like patient resignation. Later, when we were alone, I asked about the correct way to address them.
I exist between states in more ways than one.
Thorn explained, hands moving through a demonstration of shadow anchoring as they spoke.
Gender is another threshold most people insist on viewing as a binary rather than a spectrum. Male, female. These are endpoints on a continuum where the interesting possibilities exist in transitions between defined categories.
Their explanation resonated with my own experiences of living between conventional classifications. Just as I navigated the spaces between light and darkness, Thorn moved fluidly between and beyond traditional gender identities, another manifestation of their threshold nature.
In the Eastern Territories, threshold walkers have been recognized for centuries as embodying this fluidity in all aspects of existence. We're called the between named in their oldest texts, much more poetic than the academic terminology used in Western magical traditions.
This revelation clarified something fundamental about Thorn that I hadn't been able to articulate. The sense that they existed in a state of perpetual transition, belonging fully to neither one category nor another, but moving with comfortable certainty within liminal spaces that most people either feared or failed to perceive at all. But what truly set Thorn apart was their immediate recognition of my nature.
Shadow affinity.
They said quietly during our first private meeting. The words offered not as a question, but as simple acknowledgement.
Rare and valuable.
I found myself responding with unexpected honesty, despite years of practice in denying or deflecting such observations. How did you know? Thorn smiled slightly.
It recognizes itself. I walk thresholds, the boundaries between defined states. Your shadows are similar spaces, just differently expressed.
For the first time since my mother's abstract teachings, I encountered someone who could speak about my abilities with genuine understanding, rather than merely practical application. Thorn explained concepts that gave structure to what had been instinctive for me. The nature of liminal spaces, the power of transitions, the relationship between shadow and substance.
You've developed impressive control through necessity.
Thorn observed after witnessing one of my shadow manipulations during a minor operation.
Imagine what you might accomplish with proper theoretical foundations.
With Mira's cautious approval, I began studying with Thorn during carefully allocated time between operations. These sessions proved transformative. Thorn taught me to conceptualize shadows not merely as absence of light, but as thresholds between illumination and darkness, spaces with their own properties and potential. Under their guidance, my abilities expanded exponentially. I learned to create shadow anchors that allowed me to return to specific locations across considerable distances. I discovered how to perceive emotional imprints in shadow spaces, reading residual feelings left in rooms long after occupants departed. Most significantly, I began to understand the threshold realm itself, the parallel space my shadow paths temporarily accessed.
Think of normal reality as a tapestry.
Thorn explained during one lesson.
Most people only see the completed pattern. Those with threshold magic can perceive the spaces between threads, even move through them when necessary.
Beyond technical instruction, Thorn offered something I had unconsciously craved: connection with someone who shared my fundamental difference from ordinary people. Mira had accepted my abilities and helped me develop practical applications, but could never truly understand their nature. Thorn lived in the same liminal space I occupied, comprehending both the power and isolation such gifts created. Their philosophical discussions particularly impacted me. Thorn approached threshold magic not merely as a tool, but as a perspective, a way of perceiving reality that valued transitions and in-between states as sites of possibility rather than uncertainty.
Those, like us,
Thorne said during one evening discussion.
we see complexity where others insist on simplicity. We recognize that most important things happen not in firmly defined states, but in transitions between them.
This framework helped me contextualize my ongoing struggle with identity. Since childhood, I had attempted to reconcile seemingly contradictory aspects of myself, my ethical principles with my criminal activities, my desire for connection with my need for self-protection, my shadow affinity with my longing for light.
The mistake
Thorne suggested gently.
is assuming these must be reconciled at all. Your strength lies precisely in your ability to exist between conventional categories, to move fluidly among them while maintaining your essence.
Over 6 months, Thorne became more than a teacher. They became my confidant in matters I couldn't discuss even with Mira. The existential questions my magic raised, the experiences unique to threshold walkers, the subtle alienation that came from perceiving reality differently than those around me. During one of our evening sessions, I brought the small book Mira had gifted me years before, the treatise on threshold magic from the Eastern Territories that had appeared on my bed after I'd first revealed the full extent of my shadow abilities during the warehouse rescue. I still remembered the precise handwriting inside the front cover. Knowledge is protection. Develop all your weapons. Thorne's reaction when I placed the book between us was immediate and profound. Their mismatched eyes widened, and for once, their composed demeanor gave way to genuine surprise.
Penumbral pathways.
They whispered, one finger hovering above the worn leather binding but not quite touching it, as if the book itself might disappear if handled too directly.
Ravi Moonshadow's original text, not a copy or translation.
Their voice held reverence I hadn't heard before.
There are perhaps 5 original editions left in existence. Where did you get this?
Mira gave it to me, I said, watching their reaction carefully. After I used shadow manipulation during an operation. She never explained how she acquired it. Thorne carefully opened the book, their long fingers turning pages with delicate precision. They murmured,
Your mentor has resources beyond what she reveals. This particular edition belonged to the Eastern Threshold Academy's restricted collection for over a century before it disappeared during the Veiled conflicts.
They looked up at me.
It's considered the foundational text for understanding the relationship between shadow manipulation and threshold navigation.
I gestured toward a specific passage that had particularly resonated with me. This section about shadow essence being neither absence nor presence but a state of potentiality. It helped me conceptualize what I was experiencing but couldn't articulate. Thorne studied the passage, a slight smile forming.
Moonshadow was centuries ahead of conventional magical theory. While Western traditions were still debating whether shadow was merely light's absence, he recognized it as a fundamental state of reality, a threshold condition with its own properties and potential.
But some parts remain impenetrable to me, I admitted, turning to later chapters where the text grew increasingly complex, especially these sections about shadow resonance and emotional imprinting. Thorne closed their eyes briefly, as if accessing distant memory. When they spoke again, their accent became more pronounced, giving their words a rhythmic quality almost like recitation.
Shadow retains impression of that which casts it, not merely in form, but in essence. The emotional state of the caster leaves resonance within Shadow's memory, accessible to those who understand proper perception techniques.
They opened their eyes, the amber one seeming to glow slightly in the dim light of our study space.
Moonshadow is describing what my people call shadow reading, the ability to perceive emotional imprints left within darkness.
Is that possible? I asked, thinking of the practical application such an ability might offer.
More than possible, it's an advanced application of your existing capabilities. You already sense Shadow's properties beyond what ordinary perception allows. This is merely expanding that awareness to include the emotional resonance Shadow absorbs from those who interact with it.
They turned to another page, pointing to a diagram I had found particularly confusing.
This illustrates the technique. See how the perception extends not just outward into shadow space, but inward toward its emotional essence. The threshold walker maintains balanced awareness of both physical properties and emotional resonance simultaneously.
Mira never mentioned anything like this, I said, trying to reconcile this new information with years of practical shadow work.
She likely doesn't know. Few outside Eastern traditions understand these advanced applications. Western magical frameworks tend to focus on utility rather than essence, what shadow can do rather than what shadow is.
That distinction struck me deeply. The difference between approaching shadow as a tool versus understanding it as a state of being with its own nature and properties. It reflected my own evolving relationship with my abilities, the gradual shift from seeing them as separate skills to recognizing them as integral aspects of my identity.
This is why finding others with similar gifts matters so deeply.
Thorne continued, their voice softening.
Without shared understanding, we develop only fragments of our potential. Each threshold walker discovers certain aspects independently, but the complete tradition requires community, shared knowledge passed between those who experience reality from this unique perspective.
We spent hours that night exploring the treatise together, Thorne translating passages that had remained opaque to me, explaining concepts that bridged the gap between my intuitive practice and formal understanding. They showed how certain passages connected directly to abilities I had developed instinctively, providing theoretical framework for what I had discovered through necessity.
Your shadow anchors?
They noted, referring to fixed points I established for navigation.
Moon Shadow describes these as permanent thresholds, stable transitions between conventional space and liminal reality. What you've created intuitively, he spent decades formalizing into theory.
As dawn approached, I recognized something profound had shifted in our relationship. Through this shared exploration of the treatise, Thorne had offered not just technical instruction, but cultural inheritance, connection to a tradition that contextualized my experiences within something larger than myself. For someone who had lived so long in isolation, even with Mara's practical mentorship, this sense of belonging to a lineage of threshold walkers provided something I hadn't realized I was missing. One evening, after a particularly intense training session where I'd managed to maintain a complex shadow path for longer than ever before, we sat in comfortable silence on the rooftop of Coastal Transit's secondary warehouse. The harbor lights reflected on the water below, creating patterns of illumination and darkness that seemed appropriate to our conversation. "When did you first know?" I asked, breaking the quiet. "About your threshold abilities." Thorne gazed out toward the horizon, their mismatched eyes reflecting the distant lights. Several moments passed before they responded.
I was very young,
They said finally.
too young to understand what was happening. Objects would shift when I was upset. Doors would open to places they shouldn't connect to. Shadows would respond to my presence in ways that frightened those around me.
They traced a pattern on the rooftop surface with one finger, a symbol I didn't recognize, but that seemed to hold meaning for them.
The village elders called it the unmooring. They believed certain children were born partially detached from fixed reality. In some Eastern communities, such children were considered blessed, potential bridges between worlds. In mine,
They paused, their expression revealing old pain before their features settled back into their usual composed neutrality.
they were considered dangerous.
I recognized the deliberate vagueness in their account. Specific details omitted, geography unspecified, timelines left unclear. Yet the emotional truth behind their words resonated with my own experiences of childhood fear and rejection. "How did you survive?" I asked. A small, enigmatic smile formed on their lips.
A traveler passing through recognized what was happening. Someone who had seen threshold abilities before and understood their nature. They intervened, persuaded my family to let me leave with them instead of proceeding with the traditional remedies.
I didn't ask what those remedies might have been. My own memories of villagers' reactions to shadow abnormalities provided sufficient context. "This traveler became your teacher?" I prompted, when Thorne fell silent again.
The first of several. I was passed between threshold practitioners across the Eastern territories for many years, never staying in one place long enough to draw attention, always moving between communities where such abilities were understood, if not always welcomed.
Thorn's gaze shifted from the distant horizon to meet mine directly.
Each mentor taught me something different, but all reinforced one principle: threshold walkers cannot survive in isolation. Our abilities require community to develop fully, yet our nature often prevents us from forming conventional bonds.
They gestured toward coastal transit's buildings below us.
What Mera has built is impressive, a structure that accommodates unconventional talents while maintaining professional distance. But it isn't designed for nurturing those born with threshold abilities. It can utilize them, even respect them, but not truly understand or develop them.
And you believe a dedicated haven could provide that? I asked, beginning to see the shape of Thorn's deeper motivations.
I know it could.
They replied with unusual intensity.
I've seen fragments of such communities during my travels, places where threshold children learned without fear, where their abilities were celebrated rather than merely tolerated. But always temporary, always vulnerable to changing political climates or religious fervor.
Their hands moved in that fluid, graceful way that characterized their gestures when discussing matters of personal importance.
Imagine a permanent sanctuary, Zara, not hidden away in mountain retreats or desert enclaves, but established with sufficient resources and protection to endure. A place where children discover their threshold nature in an environment designed to nurture it rather than suppress it.
The vision they described was undeniably compelling. I thought of my own childhood, the lonely years after my mother's death, hiding abilities I barely understood, fearing discovery by those who would condemn what they couldn't comprehend. How many are there? I asked. Children with these abilities.
More than most realize,
Thorn said quietly.
threshold gifts manifest in different ways: shadow affinity like yours, spatial manipulation, temporal sensitivity, reality perception variance. Most learn to hide these abilities or have them beaten out through fear and rejection. Some manage to find individual mentors who provide limited guidance, but comprehensive development, true community with others of their kind.
They shook their head.
That remains tragically rare.
I sensed there was more to Thorn's history than they were revealing. Gaps in their narrative that contained significant experiences they chose not to share. Their age remained impossible to determine, and their travels seemed to span territories and time frames that didn't quite align with ordinary life experience. But I respected their boundaries, just as they respected mine regarding certain aspects of my past. The children find ways to survive, I said, thinking of my own adaptations. We're resourceful.
Survival isn't enough.
Thorn replied with sudden ferocity that surprised me.
Not merely continuing to exist while hiding essential aspects of yourself, not developing fragmented abilities in isolation, reinventing techniques that others discovered centuries ago because knowledge isn't preserved and transmitted.
The intensity in their voice suggested personal stakes beyond abstract principle. Wounds that hadn't fully healed despite the passage of what seemed considerable time.
Some survive.
They continued more softly.
Many don't, and even those who do often live half-lives, never fully embracing their nature or discovering their potential.
Their gaze held mine with unusual directness.
You're exceptional, Zara, both in your natural abilities and in finding someone like Mera who accepts them without fear. But for every shadow walker who finds such accommodation, dozens more are destroyed by fear and ignorance.
We sat in silence for several minutes after that, each absorbed in our own thoughts. I couldn't deny the truth in Thorn's words. The extraordinary luck that had led me to Mera, rather than more tragic outcomes that might easily have been my fate. The random chance that separated survival from destruction seemed profoundly unjust when considered across all the children born with abilities they didn't choose and couldn't control. A sanctuary would need considerable resources, I observed finally. Political protection as well as financial support.
Yes?
Thorn agreed, their expression unreadable in the deepening evening shadows.
More than individual threshold walkers typically command, which necessitates certain compromises.
I didn't pursue that thread further that night, assuming they referred to conventional fundraising challenges or political negotiations. The full meaning of those compromises would only become clear months later, when everything changed. But that evening, watching harbor lights create patterns of illumination and shadow across the water, I felt genuine connection with someone who understood aspects of my experience that even Mara, with all her acceptance and support, could never fully comprehend, which made the eventual betrayal all the more devastating. It began innocently enough. A special operation, Thorne explained, requested directly by Mira but requiring absolute secrecy even from Coastal Transit's inner circle.
She approached me rather than you specifically to maintain compartmentalization,
Thorne explained, showing me architectural plans for what appeared to be one of our own storage facilities.
The fewer people who know about this, the better protected everyone remains if complications arise.
The request sounded perfectly aligned with Mira's typical strategy. We had implemented similar protocols many times when operations carried particular risk, information divided among participants, so that no individual possessed the complete picture, protecting both the operation and those involved. The objective seemed straightforward: retrieve specific artifacts from a secured vault within Coastal Transit's primary warehouse and relocate them temporarily to an alternate location. Thorne explained that Mira suspected internal compromise and needed to secure these items before addressing the breach.
She would handle this herself.
Thorne added,
But her current negotiations with the Harbor Authority require her visible presence elsewhere. Our window of opportunity is narrow. Tomorrow night between midnight and dawn.
The plan utilized both our talents. Thorne would neutralize the conventional security measures, mechanical locks, guard rotations, inventory records. I would navigate us through shadow paths to bypass the most sophisticated magical protections Mira had installed after our recent expansion.
The vault incorporates light-based wards specifically designed to detect shadow manipulation, but they're calibrated for external intrusion, not movement originating from within Coastal Transit's own security network.
This detail particularly convinced me of the operation's legitimacy. The security system's nuanced configuration was information few people outside our inner circle possessed. We prepared meticulously, reviewing guard schedules and security protocols, identifying optimal shadow paths, establishing contingencies if we encountered unexpected resistance. Throughout the planning, Thorne maintained the perfect balance of professional focus and personal warmth that had characterized our relationship. Not once did my instincts warn me of deception. Not once. The operation proceeded with flawless precision. Under cover of darkness, we entered the warehouse complex through service passages known only to senior personnel. Thorne neutralized the initial security measures with unsettling ease, their fingers dancing across complex lock mechanisms, as if conversing with them. When we reached sections covered by magical wards, I wrapped us both in shadow concealment, navigating through paths I had helped establish during the security system's installation. The central vault presented the greatest challenge: a chamber protected by layered defenses incorporating conventional, magical, and mechanical elements. Here, our complementary abilities proved devastatingly effective. Thorne identified the physical vulnerabilities in the system while I created shadow disruptions that temporarily blinded the magical sensors. Together, we bypassed what Mira had once described as security that would give the Royal Treasury reason for envy. Inside the vault, we found exactly what Thorne had described: a collection of artifacts carefully stored in cushioned containers. Some I recognized as items from sensitive operations, diplomatic correspondence with potential to ignite conflicts if revealed, evidence implicating prominent officials in corruption, payment ledgers documenting transactions that various clients would prefer remained confidential. Others were more mysterious, objects of apparent magical significance whose purpose I couldn't determine. These Thorne handled with particular care, securing them in specialized containers that seemed designed for their specific properties.
Focus on the documented items,
Thorne instructed.
I'll manage these.
Something in their tone, a subtle deviation from their usual measured cadence, briefly caught my attention before being dismissed in the focus of the moment. We worked efficiently, securing the targeted items and erasing evidence of our retrieval. Thorne modified inventory records while I adjusted shadow patterns to eliminate traces of our passage. Within 40 minutes, we had completed the extraction and begun our withdrawal from the complex. It was during our exit, passing through the secondary warehouse where we stored our most valuable legitimate cargo, that I noticed something amiss. A crate bearing the seal of the Silverhall Consortium, our most prestigious client, had been partially opened, its contents clearly disturbed. This deviation from the stated objective gave me pause. The Silverhall contract represented Coastal Transit's hard-won legitimacy, the cornerstone of our recent expansion. Compromising these goods directly contradicted Mara's most fundamental principles regarding client property. "Wait," I said, stepping toward the crate. "This isn't part of the operation." Thorne's expression remained neutral, but something shifted in their mismatched eyes, a calculation I had never before witnessed.
It's a necessary adjustment. The contents provide additional leverage.
Leverage for what? I asked, suspicion finally crystallizing in my mind. Mira would never authorize tampering with Silverhall goods. Their contract explicitly guarantees.
Mara didn't authorize this operation.
Thorne interrupted, their voice soft but without its usual warmth.
I had hoped to maintain the illusion longer, ideally until we were clear of the complex.
The betrayal landed like a physical blow. I instinctively gathered shadows around myself, creating distance between us. Explain. Now. Thorne sighed, seeming genuinely regretful.
The opportunity presented itself too perfectly to ignore. Coastal Transit's expanded security, combined with your shadow paths and my threshold access, together we can accomplish what neither could alone.
That's not an explanation, I said, my voice dangerously quiet as shadows thickened around my hands. Who are you working for?
Karst Guild?
Thorne admitted, seemingly unaffected by my threatening display of shadow magic.
Though working for oversimplifies the arrangement. It's an alliance of mutual benefit.
The name registered immediately. Karst, a rival guild leader whose operations spanned 3 coastal cities but had never penetrated Liar's Gate due to Mara's established dominance. Known for aggressive expansion and fewer ethical constraints than Coastal Transit, the Karst Guild had attempted to poach our specialists in the past without success. You betrayed us to a competitor, I said flatly, fury building beneath my controlled exterior. For what? Money?
For something far more valuable. Funding and protection for a school dedicated to threshold magic. A safe haven for those like us, Zara.
Their voice softened, becoming almost pleading.
Children with shadow affinity or threshold walking who might otherwise face what you and I did. Fear, rejection, forced suppression of their true nature.
The appeal to my own experiences, my childhood trauma, my years of hiding, was carefully calculated. I felt the pull of it despite my anger, understanding too well the vulnerability of children with unusual magical talents in a world that feared what it couldn't categorize. So, you steal from Mara, who gave you trust and opportunity to help these hypothetical children? I challenged, though with less certainty than before.
Sometimes you must create a small shadow to protect something larger from harsh light.
Thorne argued, their expression earnest.
The items we've taken are primarily leverage, ensuring Coastal Transit doesn't interfere with Karst's expansion into Liar's Gate. Most will eventually be returned once agreements are formalized.
Agreements? I echoed incredulously. You think Mara would ever agree to terms reached through theft and betrayal?
She's practical above all else, and the alternative would be wastefully destructive for both organizations. Besides, the school benefits everyone with threshold gifts, including you.
For a moment, I wavered. The vision Thorne described, a sanctuary where shadow magic could be openly studied and developed, where children like my younger self might find acceptance rather than fear, held undeniable appeal. Part of me, the part that had spent years hiding essential aspects of myself, wanted to believe such a place could exist. But something else, something Mara had carefully cultivated in me, recognized the fundamental dishonesty underlying Thorne's rationalization. There's a difference between shadow and deception, I said finally, the words emerging with quiet certainty. You taught me that yourself. Shadow is honest in its nature. It exists where light cannot reach, creating necessary contrast. Deception pretends to be what it isn't. I straightened, feeling shadows flow around me like water as I made my decision. What you're doing isn't casting shadow. It's falsifying light. Thorne's expression hardened slightly, disappointment evident in their mismatched eyes.
I had hoped you would understand that your experiences would help you see beyond conventional morality to the greater purpose.
I understand perfectly, I replied. You've convinced yourself that noble ends justify corrupt means. Mara taught me otherwise, that how we achieve our goals matters as much as the goals themselves.
Mira is remarkably principled for someone who built her fortune through smuggling and information theft.
The difference, I said, is that she never pretended otherwise, never betrayed those who trusted her, never sacrificed others' security for her own ambitions. I began moving toward the exit. Shadows gathered for rapid departure. We're done here, and when I tell Mara...
She already knows.
Thorne interrupted, their voice suddenly heavy with what sounded like genuine regret.
That's why I had to accelerate the timeline. Your network of informants is impressive. One reported unusual activity near the southern warehouse earlier this evening.
Cold dread replaced anger as implications crystallized in my mind. What have you done?
Nothing irreversible.
Thorne assured me quickly.
A distraction, creating sufficient chaos to secure our extraction. The karst operatives were instructed to avoid casualties.
Without waiting to hear more, I plunged into shadow, accessing the threshold realm through pure instinct rather than careful calculation. The transition was rough, disorienting, like diving into turbulent water rather than slipping beneath a calm surface. But my desperation provided focus, propelling me through liminal space toward the southern warehouse where Mara would most likely be overseeing late shipments. The scene that greeted me when I emerged was nightmare made manifest. The warehouse was engulfed in flames, the fire unnaturally intense and spreading with suspicious speed. Security personnel rushed to contain the blaze while simultaneously engaging with masked figures attempting to access storage areas under cover of the chaos. The coordinated assault bore hallmarks of professional planning, precisely the scenario our security protocols had been designed to prevent. I moved through the confusion like a shadow myself, searching desperately for Mara. I found her not in the command center where she would normally coordinate defense, but in the small office adjacent to the loading dock, collapsed against the wall with alarming stillness. Mira! I dropped to my knees beside her, feeling the shadows around me fluctuate with my distress. Her eyes opened slowly, recognition replacing momentary confusion.
Zara,
Her voice emerged weaker than I had ever heard it, triggering fresh alarm.
you're not supposed to be here.
Neither are you, I countered, quickly assessing her condition. What I found sent cold dread through my core. Her shirt was soaked with blood from wounds that appeared to be stab wounds rather than burns, precision attacks rather than chaotic combat injuries.
Targeted.
She confirmed, reading the understanding in my expression.
Cast sent professionals. Knew exactly where to find me.
She coughed, the sound wet and alarming.
Underestimated them. Mistake?
I immediately began applying pressure to the most severe wounds, my mind racing through options. I need to get you out of here. Medical attention.
No time. Listen carefully. This isn't just opportunistic theft. It's coordinated replacement. Eliminate coastal transit. Insert cast operations using our infrastructure and connections. The artifacts from the primary vault, they took them?
I nodded, shame washing through me like acid. Thorne led me to believe it was your operation. I helped them bypass security. Rather than anger or disappointment, her expression showed only grim understanding.
Clever. Using you against your own defenses.
She winced as pain evidently surged, but continued with determined focus.
Not your fault. Threshold walkers are rare. Their talents, persuasive.
I'll fix this, I promised desperately, gathering shadows to create a stretcher-like structure. Once you're safe...
Stop.
Mara's command carried the same authority it had when I was 16, momentarily freezing my preparations.
Listen to me. Some damage can't be undone. Focus on what matters now.
I stilled, recognizing the finality in her tone with growing horror. Outside, the sounds of fighting intensified as our security forces engaged the karst operatives in earnest. But in the small office, time seemed suspended between heartbeats.
2 promises.
Mira said, her breathing increasingly labored.
First, you will not seek revenge against Thorn.
What? My response emerged as barely contained fury. They orchestrated this. They betrayed...
Their motivations are complex.
She interrupted.
Misguided, yes, but not malicious at core. Revenge corrodes the pursuer more than the pursued. Learned that hard way.
I wanted to argue but couldn't deny the wisdom beneath the request. Mira had always taken the long view, considering consequences beyond immediate satisfaction. Even now, grievously wounded by betrayal, she maintained that perspective.
Second promise.
She continued, her voice weakening noticeably.
Use your gifts to protect others who exist in society's shadows. Not just for profit, for purpose.
Her hand found my face, leaving a smear of blood across my cheek in a gesture that felt ceremonial. A blessing, a marking, a transfer of responsibility.
I've watched you struggle to accept your nature.
She said, her voice barely above a whisper now.
Stop fighting it. Shadow work chose you for a reason. Find purpose in the margins where others fear to look.
I felt tears tracking down my face, cutting through the blood on my cheek. I don't know how to do this without you. Mira's smile was pained but genuine.
You haven't needed my guidance for years. Just my permission to trust yourself.
Her hand fell away, strength visibly failing.
Now, you have it.
A particularly violent explosion rocked the building, sending debris cascading from the ceiling. I instinctively created a shadow barrier above us, protecting Mira from falling fragments. When I looked back down, her eyes had closed, her breathing shallow but persistent. I promise, I whispered, committing fully to both requests despite the grief threatening to overwhelm me. Both things, I promise. Whether she heard remained uncertain. Her expression relaxed slightly, the perpetual vigilance that had characterized her features throughout our years together, finally easing into something approaching peace. Outside, the battle for coastal transit's future raged on, but in that small office, something precious and irreplaceable slipped, away between one breath and the next. Not just Mira's life, but the foundation of security and purpose I had built upon her mentorship. As Mira's breathing finally stilled, I felt something fundamental shift within my shadow magic, as if grief itself had altered its nature, adding depth and resonance previously absent. The shadows around us deepened beyond natural possibility, no longer just concealing but somehow honoring the woman who had recognized value in a desperate child's potential. For several minutes I remained motionless, one hand still pressed futilely against her wounds, the other clutching her now lifeless fingers. Around us, the warehouse continued to burn, but the shadows I had gathered held the flames at bay, creating a small pocket of stillness amid chaos. When I finally rose, something in me had changed irrevocably. The grief remained, raw and overwhelming, but beneath it lay a clarity of purpose that Mira's final words had crystallized. I had promised not to seek revenge, and I would honor that promise. But protection, preservation, purpose, these remained within my reach. With gentle care, I arranged her body in a dignified position, closing her eyes and smoothing the lines of pain from her face. Then I gathered shadows, not just around myself, but around Mira as well, creating a protective cocoon that would preserve her from the building's imminent collapse until proper retrieval became possible. Before departing, I removed a single brass bead from my dreadlocks. The first Mira had given me after my initial solo operation years ago. I placed it in her hand, closing her fingers around the small token. "Journey well," I whispered. Then, drawing shadows around myself like armor, I stepped into the threshold realm. I emerged near the primary vault we had robbed earlier, now swarming with karst operatives cataloging their acquisition. Without hesitation or remorse, I moved through their ranks like darkness itself, retrieving not all the stolen items. That would be impossible alone. but select pieces whose absence would render the remainder strategically worthless. The client ledgers without their decryption keys. The evidence of corruption without identifying documentation. Most importantly, the small obsidian box containing what Mara had once described as insurance against catastrophe, contents unknown even to me, but protected more carefully than anything else in Coastal Transit's possession. Karst's people never detected my presence. By the time they discovered the critical components missing from their plunder, I was already gone, vanished into shadow paths only I could navigate. Dawn found me miles from Liar's Gate, seated on a hilltop overlooking the coastal road, leading northward. Behind me, smoke still rose from the warehouse district, marking the end of the life I had built over 6 years. Before me stretched unknown territory, both literally and figuratively. A future without Mira's guidance, without Coastal Transit's structure, without the identity I had carefully constructed within their framework. In my possession, the salvaged strategic items, enough currency to sustain myself for several months, and Mira's final wisdom, to accept my shadow nature fully, to find purpose in society's margins, to protect others who existed in the spaces between conventional categories. As the rising sun cast my shadow long across the hillside, I made my decision. I would honor both promises to Mira. I would not pursue Thorn or Karst Guild for revenge. That path led only to further destruction without purpose. Instead, I would build something new from the ashes of what was lost. Not an empire like Coastal Transit, but a network of protection for those who needed to navigate between shadow and light. I would use my gifts not just for survival or profit, but for the purpose Mira had recognized in them all along. The brass beads in my hair caught the morning light as I stood, creating tiny points of brightness against the dark strands, small memorials to lessons learned and operations completed under Mira's guidance. I touched them briefly, a silent acknowledgement of all they represented, before turning my face northward. The shadows of my past would always be part of me, but they would no longer define my limits. Instead, they would become the foundation upon which I built something stronger, something that honored both Mira's practical wisdom and my own unique nature. As I set out on the northern road, I carried with me not just grief for what was lost, but determination to fulfill the potential Mira had recognized in a desperate child stealing purses in a marketplace. The potential to create something meaningful in the spaces between light and shadow, where most people feared to look, but where the most interesting possibilities always existed.